My duty to protect the public from its gods. The official police manual has 112 protocols for dealing with the public, but none for what to do when a 911 call is answered by a god. They teach you to de-escalate, but not how to negotiate with something that feeds on belief and bleeds pure paradox. My job begins where your prayers are answered. The rain fell in sheets, luring the streetlights into jaundiced halos on the wet asphalt. Inside Unit 74, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers was the only counterpoint to the static-laced voice from the radio. Officer Marcus Thorne kept one hand on the wheel, his gaze sweeping the derelict skeletons of the industrial district. 20 years on the force had taught him that nothing good happened on nights like this, in places like this. His partner, Officer Gabriella Chen, was reading the details off the console screen for the third time. Amelia Vance, 26. Last seen by her landlord 2 days ago. Car is still in her designated spot, but her work, Vance Industrial, some kind of specialty textile place, reports she never clocked in yesterday or today. Family filed the NP. Family business? Marcus asked, his voice a low gravel. Inherited it from her father last year, according to the file. Address should be just ahead on the left. 1412, Dockside Road. Chen pointed into the gloom. That should be it. The big brick one. Marcus slowed the cruiser, its headlights cutting a swath through the downpour, illuminating a graffiti-scarred brick facade. The sign for Vance Industrial was still visible, though rust bled from the bolts holding it to the wall. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was thick, broken only by the drumming of rain on the car's roof. They both sat for a moment, a shared, unspoken ritual of steeling themselves before stepping out into the city as forgotten corners. "Let us get it done," Marcus said, pulling his collar up. They exited the vehicle, the cold rain immediately soaking through the shoulders of their jackets. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp decay and river water. As they approached the building's main entrance, a large, corrugated steel roll-up door, Marcus felt a strange shift. It wasn't a sound, or a sight, but a sudden, jarring quiet. The relentless patter of the rain against the pavement had ceased. He stopped, holding a hand up to Chen. "You hear that?" She paused, her brow furrowed. "Hear what?" "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," he murmured, his eyes scanning the area. He took a step forward, then another. It was like walking through a wall of sound into a vacuum-sealed chamber. To his left, rain still hammered the ground. To his right, nothing. He looked up. The drops were falling, shimmering in the beam of his flashlight, but they seemed to curve away from a line just inches in front of him, as if repelled by an invisible dome. Chen's training kicked in. Her hand went to her sidearm. "Sir?" "What is this?" Marcus didn't answer. He followed the edge of the unnatural silence, his flashlight beam tracing a path along the wet concrete. It led them around the corner of the adjacent building, revealing the lot where Vance Industrial was supposed to stand. And there was nothing. It was not a vacant lot. It was not a pile of rubble from a demolition or an explosion. It was an absence. A perfect, soul-crushingly precise circle of void had been carved out of reality itself. Where the brick walls, steel girders, and concrete foundation of 1412, Dockside Road should have been, there was an absolute and utter nothingness that seemed to drink the light from his flashlight. The hole was perhaps 50 yards in diameter, its edge a razor-sharp line between the rain-slicked world and a patch of existence that had simply been deleted. The back walls of the neighboring buildings were sliced clean through, showing cross-sections of insulation, wiring, and plumbing as if in an architectural diagram. Above, the void continued into the sky, a column of emptiness that the clouds did not enter. The rain did not fall into it flowed around its unseen boundary like water around a stone. There was no wind, no sound, no smell emanating from it. It was a sensory dead zone, a wound in the world. Chen made a choked sound, a mix of disbelief and terror. She raised her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 74, we have a situation at 1412 Dockside. Requesting immediate backup and a supervisor to our location. Code." "I don't know the code for this." Her voice trembled, the professional cadence fracturing against the impossible sight. The radio answered with a burst of impenetrable static. Marcus felt his own foundations cracking. Every tactical scenario, every procedural manual, every shred of his 20 years of experience was rendered useless. This was not a crime scene, it was a violation of the laws of physics. His gaze drifted to the edge of the void, right where the property line of Vance Industrial would have met the public sidewalk. Sitting there, perfectly placed on the precipice between the mundane and the impossible, was a single woman's shoe. It was a simple black flat, untouched by the rain, its leather gleaming as if freshly polished. It was the only piece of evidence that Amelia Vance, or her entire world, had ever been here at all. The official report on the dockside void was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It spoke of a localized sinkhole and a gas line explosion that had, through a freakish confluence of pressures, vaporized the structure without significant collateral damage. Marcus Thorne had signed his name to it, just as had been ordered. The single black shoe, logged into evidence as item 3A footwear, female, recovered from perimeter, had vanished from the property locker the next day. For 2 weeks, an unnerving quiet settled over their patrol sector, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the city holding its breath. The spell broke on a Tuesday afternoon. The call that came over the radio was for a domestic disturbance in a high-rise apartment building downtown, the kind with a doorman and pretentious lobby art. The complainant, a Ms. Anya Sharma, reported her roommate was stealing things that didn't belong to him. When the dispatcher asked for clarification on the stolen items, there was a long pause before the woman said, "The echoes. He has taken all the echoes from the room." Chen shot Marcus a look as they rode the elevator up. "Echoes? You think we VE got a 1056? Person with mental illness?" "Could be," Marcus said, though the word echoes resonated with a new, unpleasant frequency in his mind. "Or just a new way to say he is being too loud. Let us see the scene before we make a diagnosis." The apartment door was opened by a woman in her late 30s, her face pale and drawn. She led them into a sparsely furnished living room with a stunning view of the city's steel and glass heart. A man sat perfectly still in a wooden chair, facing the window. He was gaunt, with eyes that seemed to look through the skyline and into whatever lay beyond. "That's him." "Julian," Miss Sharma whispered, wringing her hands. "He hasn't moved for an hour. Just sits there. And the room, it feels empty. Flat." Marcus approached the man. "Sir? My name is Officer Thorne. We received a call about a disturbance. Is everything all right?" Julian didn't turn. His voice, when it came, was soft and melodic, like wind chimes. "Everything is perfectly balanced. The accounts are settled." "What accounts are those, Julian?" Jen asked, her tone gentle, non-threatening. "The resonance. The memories left in the walls," the man said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "She hoarded them. I simply liberated the excess." Marcus felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The air in the room was strangely thin, devoid of the faint, ambient hum of a lived-in space. It was like being in a soundproofed studio. Julian slowly turned his head, his gaze finally falling upon the two officers. His eyes were a brilliant, electric blue, and they didn't seem to be focusing on them so much as on the space they occupied. "The city is coming undone," Julian said, his voice now layered with a faint, whispering undertone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The old packs are broken. The locks are rusted through." "Sir, I need you to stand up for me," Marcus said, his hand hovering near his service weapon. The situation was escalating past any known protocol. Julian smiled again, a serene, beatific expression. "There is no need. I am already leaving." He began to glow. It started as a faint luminescence around the edges of his body, then intensified, turning his skin translucent. A chorus of whispers filled the apartment, 1,000 voices speaking a language that scraped at the edges of their hearing. Light, brilliant and golden, began to pour from Julian's eyes and mouth. He didn't scream or struggle, he simply unwound, his physical form dissolving into a torrent of radiant particles and overlapping sounds. Within seconds, he was gone. The light and the whispers vanished, plunging the room back into its unnatural silence. Where the chair stood, there was now nothing. Where the man's feet had rested on the hardwood floor, a fractal, web-like scorch mark was burned into the wood. It was blacker than any char Marcus had ever seen, a patch of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the light falling on it. Chen was already on the radio, her voice tight with controlled shock, requesting a supervisor and a forensics team. The scene was locked down within the hour, but the CSU techs were baffled. The scorch mark registered no temperature. Swabs came back sterile. A portable mass spectrometer brought to the scene returned only a string of impossible readings, identifying elements that didn't exist on the periodic table. Their preliminary reports were typed in stunned silence back at the precinct. Before they could be filed, 2 individuals arrived. They weren't in uniform, but in plain, immaculate black suits. They introduced themselves as being from the Office of Internal Oversight and presented credentials that made their lieutenant go pale and offer them his private office. Marcus and Chen were interviewed separately. The questions were bizarrely specific. Describe the quality of the light. Did the whispers form any recognizable phonemes? At any point did you perceive a temporal distortion? An hour later, they were handed new, pre-written reports to sign. The official narrative was that they had responded to a domestic call where the suspect, a known pyromaniac with a history of mental instability, had immolated himself with a chemical accelerant. The scorch mark was evidence of the accelerant. Miss Sharma, it was claimed, was an unreliable witness suffering a psychotic break. Their original reports were taken. The evidence logs were confiscated. Every sample taken by CSU was signed over to the men in black. As they left, one of them paused beside Marcus's desk. "Officer Thorne," he said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "A word of advice. Some evidence is not meant to be filed. It is meant to be forgotten. For the good of the public order." He then walked away, leaving Marcus and Chen with the signed lie and the chilling certainty that they were no longer dealing with the laws of man. The summons came not through official channels, but as a single, crisp manila envelope left on the driver's seat of his personal vehicle at the end of his shift. Inside was a single card with a room number SB04 and a time 0800 the next morning. There was no name, no signature. When Marcus ran the room number through the precinct S directory, the system returned a location not found error. Chen received no such invitation. This was for him alone. The next morning, he found the designated corridor in the precinct S sub-basement, a place usually reserved for long-term evidence storage and decommissioned equipment. The hallway was colder than the rest of the building, the air still and silent. At the very end, past rows of dusty shelving, was a heavy steel door marked only with a small, brass plate that read 04. It had no keycard scanner, only a simple, old-fashioned lock. He knocked. The door was opened by a tall, severe-looking woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face was a mask of stoic professionalism, and her eyes, a pale, piercing gray, assessed him in a single, sweeping glance. She wore the uniform of a captain, the bars on her collar gleaming under the stark fluorescent light. "Officer Thorne. On time. I'm Captain Eva Rostova. Come in." Her voice was low and carried a faint, unplaceable accent. The office was Spartan and meticulously organized. Behind her desk, a series of antique-looking maps were pinned to a large corkboard, but the coastlines and borders they depicted were subtly wrong, as if drawn from a different history. The only other furniture was a table and 2 chairs. Rostova gestured for him to sit, then took her own seat behind the desk, folding her hands over a thick, unmarked file. "I will be direct, Officer Thorne. We do not have time for pleasantries," she began, her gaze unwavering. 2 weeks ago, you responded to a missing persons call at 1412 Dockside Road and witnessed a localized reality displacement. 3 days ago, you were present for the terminal event of a man named Julian, who subsequently underwent a phase transition from a biological to a mimetic state. Your official reports on both incidents were, for reasons of public security, wholly inaccurate. Marcus sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He felt no surprise, only a grim sense of confirmation. "Who are you?" "I am the commanding officer of the Metaphysical Containment Division," Rostova stated, as if announcing the head of traffic or homicide. the MCD. We are the department you call when the laws of physics are broken as egregiously as the penal code. This office, this division, does not officially exist. We are Division 0. She slid the file across the desk. It was his. Not just his service record, but psychological evaluations, commendations, and, clipped to the inside cover, high-resolution photographs. One showed the clean-cut void at dockside. The other showed the impossible, light-absorbing scorch mark on the apartment floor. This city, Rostova continued, per tone that of a lecturer, is a fulcrum. A place where the veil between what is and what should not be is unusually thin. For reasons we are still trying to understand, it attracts incursions. Anomalous entities. Beings and phenomena that operate on principles outside of our known science. To the public, if they are perceived at all, they are gods, demons, ghosts, miracles. To us, they are unauthorized phenomena. Unsecured threats. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady. The men in the black suits. The Office of Internal Oversight. That was you. A necessary deception, Rostova conceded with a slight nod. Our primary directive is containment. That includes containing information. Panic is a more dangerous contagion than any entity we've ever logged. We observed your conduct at both scenes, Officer Thorne. And we reviewed your psychological profile. You did not panic. You did not rationalize. You observed, you acted, and you reported, even when the reality of the situation defied every frame of reference you possessed. That is a rare and valuable quality. She leaned forward, the intensity in her eyes sharpening. The frequency of these events is increasing. The old safeguards are failing. My division is understaffed, and I need officers who can stand on the edge of an abyss and not lose their footing. Your partner, Officer Chen, is a fine cop, but her profile shows a lower threshold for cognitive dissonance. She would break. The data suggests you will not. The offer was laid bare on the desk between them, unspoken but immense. This was not just a job, it was a sentence to a life of secrets and horrors that no civilian, and few cops, could ever comprehend. It was a commitment to policing the very edge of sanity. Your current duties are noble, Rostova said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. You protect the public from criminals. We protect the public from its own gods, from the things it worships and fears in the dark. The duty is the same. Only the scale of the perpetrator has changed. Marcus looked from the file to the captain's unflinching eyes. He thought of the perfect circle of nothingness, of the man who unraveled into whispers, and of the gnawing sense that the world he had sworn to protect was a fragile facade. His duty had always been clear. It hadn't changed, not really. It had just gotten bigger. When do I start? He asked. Marcus Thorne's transfer was a paper phantom. His old locker was emptied, his patrol car reassigned, and his name was moved to a special liaison, mayor's office roster, a bureaucratic dead end where cops were sent to fade into retirement. His real orientation began back behind the steel door marked 04, which opened into a long, sterile corridor he hadn't seen before. It led to a small, windowless briefing room that felt like a cross between a university seminar hall and a bomb shelter. Captain Rostova was there, standing beside a man who looked more like a tenured professor than a cop. He was slender, with a tweed jacket slightly too large for his frame, wire-rimmed glasses, and a cascade of unruly brown hair. He watched Marcus enter with an expression of mild, academic curiosity, as if observing a new species for the first time. Officer Thorne, this is Dr. Alistair Finch, Rostova said by way of introduction. He is our senior analyst and resident expert on things that defy expertise. He will be conducting your initial protocols briefing. With a nod, the captain departed, leaving Marcus alone with the doctor. Welcome, Officer Thorne. Or perhaps, given our unique purview, welcome to the unreality, Finch said, his voice calm and pleasant. He gestured to a large whiteboard behind him, covered in what looked like a mix of complex equations and ancient sigils. Forget everything you learned at the academy about predictable human behavior. Our suspects are not human, and their behavior is not predictable. It is, however, often governed by a certain esoteric logic. Your survival depends on learning that logic. Finch picked up a dry erase marker. We'll begin with basic field observations. Protocol 1: avert your gaze from perfectly symmetrical shadows. Do not allow them to fall within your direct line of sight. Certain entities use bilateral symmetry as a vector for psychological imprinting. Prolonged exposure can lead to conceptual realignment. Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. He expected something strange, but this was a tactical briefing from a nightmare. Protocol 2, Finch continued, tapping the board. Under no circumstances are you to speak your own full name in a sequence of 3. Not in response to a question, not in jest, not even to yourself. Naming conventions have a certain power in the spheres we interact with. Triangulation of a name is a form of summons. We have lost officers to this. He moved down the board, his tone never wavering from its placid, instructional cadence. Protocol 3 concerns issued equipment. He pointed to a table where a standard issue sidearm sat next to a box of ammunition. The cartridges, however, had a dull, grayish sheen. Your standard rounds are useless against most non-corporeal or trans-dimensional threats. You will be issued salt iron alloy rounds. They disrupt ectoplasmic forms and destabilize localized reality fields. They are, however, less effective against conventional targets, so choose your ammunition based on the suspect's state of matter. Marcus finally spoke. How are we supposed to know what state of matter they're in? Finch offered a thin smile. That's the art of it, officer. Now, on to temporal phenomena. If you experience a moment of déjà vu in a suspected active zone, do not dismiss it. Immediately alter your course of action. Do the opposite of what you were about to do. Repetitive temporal loops are a common hunting tactic for chronivores. He paused, letting the information settle. Marcus felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't a list of rules, it was a catalog of ways to die that the human mind was not equipped to comprehend. Finch seemed to sense his unease. It seems paradoxical, I know, the analyst said, his expression softening into something like sympathy. We are asking you, a man of order, to operate in a world without it. But there are patterns. We don't always understand the why, but we have extensively documented the what happens when. Your service weapon is for the things you can see. These protocols, he gestured to the board, are your weapon against the things that see you. Finch pushed his glasses up his nose. Final protocol for today. And the most important. Never ever assume a scene is secure just because the threat is gone. Some things leave behind echoes, conceptual residue. The scorch mark from Julian S. apartment? Forensics has confirmed it is not a mark on the floor. It is a hole through the floor, a pinprick into a dimension of absolute silence and cold. Your job isn't just to stop the threat. It's to clean up the impossibilities they leave behind. Marcus looked from the incomprehensible notes on the whiteboard to the unervingly placid face of the man explaining them. His entire career had been built on a foundation of tangible facts, physical evidence, and human law. That foundation was now gone, replaced by a rulebook written in folklore and paid for in blood. His duty remained the same, but the beat had just expanded to include hell itself. Marcus Thorne's first week in Division 0 was a disorienting blend of the mundane and the metaphysical. He spent his days in the sub-basement, studying case files filled with redacted reports and impossible photographs, a staircase that descended into itself, a bus that arrived from a year in the future, a rain of frogs that were anatomically correct but made of glass. He was learning the city's secret history, one incomprehensible incident at a time. The first call to action came not with a siren, but with a quiet summons to the briefing room. Dr. Finch stood before a city map covered in a rash of small red pens, each marking a 911 call from the last 48 hours. The incidents were a chaotic spray of public disturbances: a man on a street corner suddenly convinced he could fly, a librarian who began compulsively tearing pages from books to build a nest, a traffic jam caused by 24 drivers simultaneously stopping their cars to stare at the sun. The incidents are geographically clustered, but diagnostically random, Finch explained, pointing a slender wooden dowel at a dense patch of pens in the warehouse district. Psychotic breaks, fugue states, temporary mania. No common drug, no environmental toxin, no discernible pattern in the victim's demographics. Except for one. He clicked a button on a remote, and a complex waveform appeared on a monitor beside the map. This is a recording from a wideband radio scanner we have positioned downtown. To the human ear, it's just static. But when you analyze the signal, you find a highly complex, non-random pattern embedded in the noise. It is not sound. It's a structured data stream being broadcast on an open frequency. A signal that makes people crazy? Marcus asked, the question sounding crude and simplistic in the sterile room. A slight oversimplification, but functionally accurate, Finch replied. We believe we are dealing with a mimetic entity, a god of the airwaves, if you will. It is broadcasting a concept, an idea so potent and alien that the human mind cannot process it without suffering a catastrophic failure. It doesn't need to be heard, it only needs to be within range. Your brain is an antenna, officer, and it is picking up a signal it was never meant to receive. Captain Rostova, who had been observing silently from the back of the room, stepped forward. Your mission is to locate the source of this broadcast and neutralize it. You will not be working alone. Another officer entered the room. She was compact and moved with an efficient, disciplined grace. Her face was all sharp angles, and her dark eyes held a weary alertness. Officer Thorne, this is Officer Akari Kaito, Rostova said. She will be your field partner. Kaito gave Marcus a single, professional nod. Thorne. Finch wheeled over a cart of equipment. Standard comms are out, they could carry the signal as harmonics. You will use these. He held up two bulky headsets that looked like noise-canceling headphones from a firing range. Cognitive dampeners. They generate a low-level psychic white noise, a stream of meaningless, contradictory information that will occupy the brain's pattern recognition centers. It will feel like having a boring dream at the edge of your consciousness. It will keep the signal out. Next, he produced a device that looked like a souped-up Geiger counter. This is a mimetic field detector. It won't lead you directly to the antenna, but it will react to the conceptual pressure the signal exerts on local space. The needle will climb as you get closer to the source. It is, regrettably, our best tool for triangulation. 30 minutes later, Marcus and Kaito were in an unmarked panel van, crawling through the warehouse district. Kaito drove with an unnerving calm, her eyes constantly scanning. Marcus held the detector, its needle twitching erratically. They passed a woman who was methodically painting a storefront window with mud, her movements fluid and serene. A block later, a group of men were gathered around a fire hydrant, speaking to it in hushed, reverent tones. No one was violent. They were simply disconnected from the shared reality. You get used to it, Kaito said, not taking her eyes off the road. The job is not to understand them. It's to keep the rest of the city from ending up like them. The needle on the detector began to climb steadily as they neared a towering, dilapidated brick building, its upper floors open to the sky. There, Marcus said, pointing. The signal strength is peaking here. They parked a block away and donned the cognitive dampeners. The world went audibly silent, but a faint, irritating mental hum began at the back of Marcus' mind, like trying to remember a forgotten word. They entered the building, moving up flights of debris-strewn stairs. On the top floor, a makeshift ladder led to the roof. The source of the broadcast was a grotesque sculpture of rust and wire. A pirate radio antenna had been modified, twisted into a spiral, and interwoven with what looked disturbingly like animal bones and strips of magnetic tape from old cassettes. It hummed not with electricity, but with a palpable sense of purpose, warping the air around it. Kaito handed Marcus a tool that looked like a pair of industrial bolt cutters, but with a heavy power pack attached. Isolate and sever the primary coaxial feed. Don't touch the antenna itself. Marcus moved forward, the mental static from the dampeners seeming to intensify as he neared the alien structure. He found the thick cable feeding into the base of the antenna, clamped the jaws of the cutter around it, and squeezed the trigger. There was a blinding flash of blue-white light and a soundless concussion that he felt in his bones. The oppressive pressure that had saturated the air vanished instantly. He looked over the edge of the roof. Down on the street, the woman painting the window had stopped, staring at the muddy streaks on the glass in confusion. The men who had been worshipping the fire hydrant were looking at each other, bewildered, as if waking from a strange dream. The signal was cut. The god of static was dead. The St. Jude Bridge was a relic, a skeletal arch of rust-red iron that connected the city's industrial south with the largely abandoned port district. For decades, it had been a commuter shortcut. In the past week, it had become a trap. For vehicles had been found parked mid-span, engines cold, doors unlocked. The drivers were gone. The only thing left behind in each car was a single, crudely minted bronze coin, resting on the dashboard where the morning sun would strike it. The coins were ancient, bearing the image of a hooded figure pulling a skiff untraceable to any known currency, modern or historical. The bridge was built on the site of an old ferry crossing, Dr. Finch explained, his image clear on the briefing room monitor from his lab. Pre-colonial. The local tribes had stories of a spirit guarding the water there, one who demanded payment for safe passage. It seems that with the city's, let us call it metaphysical infrastructure weakening, old claims are being reasserted. This entity, this ferryman, is treating the bridge as its river and is collecting its toll. And the toll is the drivers? Marcus asked, his jaw tight. The toll is 1 soul per crossing, Finch confirmed, his expression grim. The coin is its receipt. Direct confrontation is inadvisable. We are dealing with a territorial entity bound by ancient, conceptual rules. We cannot arrest it. We cannot shoot it. We must, therefore, outmaneuver it. Finch's solution was, as always, both brilliant and deeply unsettling. The entity's claim is tied to the physical and conceptual space of the bridge itself. However, for a very brief period during twilight, when the angle of the sun creates a specific resonant frequency with the iron in the bridge as superstructure, a secondary path becomes accessible. A non-Euclidean transit vector. A ghost road, for lack of a better term. On the screen, a diagram of the bridge appeared. A dotted line branched off from the main road, looped through what should have been empty air beside the bridge, and reconnected on the other side. This route exists for approximately 7 minutes, Finch said. It is spatially inconsistent but temporally sound. Your GPS will show you driving in a straight line. Your eyes will tell you something very different. You must trust the instruments, not your senses. We need to re-establish a path of safe passage. Your team will lead a small convoy across, proving the toll can be bypassed. This should, theoretically, satisfy the entity's rule set by creating a new, toll-free crossing. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Marcus sat in the driver's seat of the lead MCD vehicle, a reinforced black SUV. Kaido was in the passenger seat, monitoring a console that displayed their vital signs and a precise atomic clock. 2 identical vehicles were behind them. The entrance to the St. Jude Bridge was cordoned off with standard police barriers, hiding their operation in plain sight as a structural inspection. 3 minutes to window, Kaido reported, her voice calm. Finch's voice crackled in Marcus' earpiece. Remember, Officer Thorne. Maintain a constant speed of 45 miles per hour. Do not brake. Do not accelerate. And whatever you see, keep your eyes on the road ahead as indicated by the navigation system. The atomic clock on the console ticked over to the designated time. Window is open, Kaido said. Engage. Marcus put the vehicle in gear and drove onto the bridge. For the first few hundred yards, everything was normal. Then, the GPS on the dashboard pinged. A calm, synthesized voice announced, in 200 feet, take the perceptual exit on your right. Marcus' hands tightened on the wheel. To his right was a 20-story drop to the dark river below. There was no exit. Yet he held his course, his eyes locked on the road. Trust the machine, Thorne, Kaido said softly. He eased the wheel to the right. The SUV's tires did not meet empty air. Instead, the world seemed to fold. The familiar iron girders of the bridge were replaced by a smooth, gray road curving through a silent, starless twilight. The city lights were gone. The river was gone. The two other SUVs followed, their headlights cutting lonely paths through the impossible space. The air in the cabin grew cold. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his foot steady on the accelerator. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw things that his mind refused to process: geometric shapes drifting slowly through the void, structures like inverted cathedrals hanging in the darkness. The road ahead remained clear, a ribbon of tangible reality in an ocean of madness. For minutes remaining, Kaito announced, her gaze fixed on her console. The silence was the most unnerving part. There was no engine noise, no sound of tires on pavement. There was only the low hum of the vehicle's electronics and Finch's voice, a steady anchor to reality. You are halfway across the transit vector. Maintain speed. Do not look at the reflections in the side mirrors. Marcus fought the instinct to check his mirrors. A deep, resonant tolling, like a distant cathedral bell, echoed through the cabin, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull. Entity is aware of your transit, Finch said, his voice tight. It is testing the boundary. Ignore it. 3 minutes. The road ahead began to shimmer. Up ahead, the familiar lights of the port district blinked into existence, hanging in the void like a promised land. He aimed for them, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The gray road began to merge back into the worn asphalt of the bridge. The iron trusses reappeared, and with a final, jarring lurch, the tires were back on the physical structure. The tolling bell ceased. Marcus glanced at the clock. 6 minutes and 42 seconds. He had crossed. Behind him, the other two SUVs safely materialized back onto the bridge. He looked in the rearview mirror. The St. Jude Bridge was just a bridge again, a silent silhouette against the dying light. The ghost road was gone. Convoy is across, he reported into his mic, his voice hoarse. Scene is stable. Understood, Finch replied. The path is re-established. The ferryman's claim is, for now, circumvented. Well done, Division 0. The entity manifested at City General Hospital. Finch classified it as a limerence-based hunger spirit, a psychic parasite that fed on the ambient emotions of grief and desperation that saturated the building. It had taken root in the hospital cafeteria, causing a localized phenomenon where food would turn to ash and people's mouths and patients would waste away from a hunger that no amount of nourishment could satisfy. The mission was straightforward: deploy a set of 4 resonant field projectors to create a containment bubble, then collapse the bubble inward, shunting the entity into a pocket dimension for later processing. It was supposed to be a clean, non-violent extraction. The cafeteria had been evacuated under the pretense of a gas leak. Marcus Kaito and 2 other MCD officers, Ruiz and O'Connell, moved in formation, each carrying a heavy, tripod-mounted projector. They set them up in a carefully measured square around the center of the room, where the entity's presence was strongest, a cold spot that made their teeth ache. Projectors are in position, Kaito reported into our comms. Ready to activate on your mark, Finch. Acknowledged, Finch's voice replied from their earpieces. Initiating containment field in 3, 2, 1. A low hum filled the air as the projectors powered on. 4 beams of shimmering, colorless energy shot out, connecting to form a perfect, shimmering cube in the middle of the room. Inside the cube, the air distorted, and a vaguely humanoid shadow writhed in silent fury. The operation was going by the book. That's when the door to the kitchen swung open. A young doctor, no older than 30, stepped out, holding a tablet. Dr. Eris Thorne. No relation. Shed missed the evacuation announcement, her chart said later. Her eyes went wide at the sight of 4 heavily armed officers and the glowing cube of energy dominating the room. Stay back. Marcus yelled, his voice echoing in the large space. But she was confused, startled. She took a step forward, directly into the path of O'Connell's projector. Her shoulder grazed the edge of the containment beam for less than a second. The beam itself was non-physical, a projection of coherent causality. It did no physical damage. She stumbled back, blinking, seemingly unharmed. The entity, however, seized the momentary fluctuation in the field. The shadow form lunged, striking the inside wall of the energy cube. The projectors whined, and O'Connell was thrown back as his unit overloaded with a shower of sparks. The containment field collapsed. Field is down. The entity is loose. Kaido shouted, drawing her salt iron sidearm. The shadow dissipated, melting back into the ambient cold of the room. The mission was a failure. But that wasn't the worst of it. Dr. Thorne was sitting on the floor, her tablet clattering beside her. She looked up at Marcus, a placid, disconnected smile on her face. "The floor is cold," she said, as if commenting on the weather. She then picked up a salt shaker from a nearby table, opened it, and poured the contents over her head. She laughed, a light, carefree sound. The internal review was held the next day in Rostova's office. The mood was somber. "Dr. Eris Thorne is physically healthy," the captain said, reading from a file. "No radiation, no neurological damage. She is, however, for all intents and purposes, gone." Finch's face appeared on the monitor, his expression unusually grave. The containment field operates by enforcing a localized, hyper-rational state of cause and effect. Grazing the bean, even for an instant, appears to have had a rebound effect on the doctor's neural pathways. Her mind has been permanently severed from the concept of causality. She perceives events, but not the links between them. To her, everything is a random, disconnected series of occurrences. Marcus stared at the polished surface of the table. He remembered the doctor's empty laugh. She wasn't insane. She was living in a world without consequences, without a because. A world where pouring salt on your head was no more or less logical than walking through a door. "She will be cared for," Rostova stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We have a secure, long-term care facility for this kind of collateral damage. Her official diagnosis will be a rare, early-onset form of dementia. Her family will be told it was a tragic medical anomaly." The words were cold, pragmatic. Necessary. But they settled like lead in Marcus's gut. He had sworn an oath to protect the public. He had just participated in the affected destruction of a civilian's mind, and the procedure for covering it up was as routine as filing a traffic ticket. "This was a procedural failure," Rostova continued, her gaze falling on Marcus. "Officer Thorne, you were the team lead. The civilian's entry into a hot zone falls under your responsibility. This will be noted in your file." Marcus met her stare. "Yes, Captain." He knew it wasn't a punishment. It was a test. Rostova was watching to see if the weight of this necessary collateral damage would break him. He thought of the oath he took. To protect and serve. But who did you protect when the only way to save the city was to sacrifice its citizens, one mind at a time? What was the acceptable number of casualties in a war no one knew was being fought? Leaving the office, he felt the true weight of his new duty for the first time. It wasn't about fighting monsters. It was about living with the price of their containment. The incident at the hospital left a mark on Marcus. He became quieter, more methodical, his focus narrowing to the cold mechanics of the job. He needed to understand the roles of this new, impossible beat, not just to survive, but to prevent another Dr. Thorne. Seeing this shift, Dr. Finch made an unconventional decision. One afternoon, he led Marcus not to the briefing room, but to a different steel door in the sub-basement, this one requiring a retinal scan and a keycard. "Captain Rostova believes that field operatives should only be given information on a need-to-know basis," Finch said as the heavy door hissed open. "I, on the other hand, am of the opinion that you cannot effectively police a city if you don't understand the laws it was built on. Welcome to the archives." The room was vast, circular, and lined from floor to ceiling with endless shelves of leather-bound books, scrolls, clay tablets, and strange, humming metallic data drives. It smelled of old paper, ozone, and dust motes that had been ancient when the city was founded. This was not just a collection of case files, it was the city's true, secret charter. "Our predecessors were not as technologically sophisticated as we are," Finch explained, walking along the curved aisles. "They couldn't shunt an entity into a pocket dimension. They had to negotiate. They made pacts, treaties. They drew borders not with ink on a map, but with cold iron and running water. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger from a shelf. The title on the spine was embossed in gold leaf: Civic Works Foundational Agreements, Volume 1, 1888-1912. He opened it on a large wooden table. The pages were filled with elegant, hand-drawn schematics that looked like city planning documents, but the annotations were bizarre. "Look here," Finch said, pointing to a blueprint for the city's original sewer system. The engineers were instructed to use a specific ratio of iron to copper in the pipes. Officially, it was for durability. The real reason, he tapped a scribbled note in the margin, is that the specific alloy creates a low-level electromagnetic field that is disruptive to telluric, or Earth-based, entities. The city's sewer system isn't just for sanitation. It's a cage. He turned the page to a diagram of the electrical grid. The original power lines were laid out in these specific geometric patterns. They look inefficient to a modern electrical engineer, but the shape of the grid creates a city-wide thaumaturgic ward, repelling incorporeal intruders. The subway tunnels? He flipped again. Their paths were not chosen for geological stability. They were routed to trace and reinforce the naturally occurring ley lines of the area, creating a closed loop of psychic energy that locks things in. Marcus stared at the documents, a profound and disturbing understanding dawning on him. He wasn't just a cop in a city. He was a guard in a massive, cleverly disguised prison. The very infrastructure he had spent his life driving over and under to the roads, the pipes, the wires, was a containment system of breathtaking scale and complexity. The city wasn't a hotspot for anomalous entities because they were attracted to it. It was a hotspot because they were already here, bound by forgotten agreements and held in check by the urban landscape itself. The founders made deals, Finch said, his voice low. They offered the entities this territory as a reservation, a place to exist, in exchange for an agreement not to prey on the populace. The city was the fence. The problem is, the infrastructure is aging. The packs are being forgotten. He led Marcus to a newer section of the archive, filled with modern technical readouts. He pointed to a screen displaying a diagnostic of the power grid. Several sections were blinking red. When the city upgraded the downtown grid to fiber optic cables, they unknowingly tore a hole in the warding system, Finch explained. The new subway extension cut across a major ley line instead of following it. Every urban renewal project, every piece of modernization, is another bar being sawed through in the cage. The old gods are noticing. The ferryman on the St. Jude Bridge wasn't a new arrival, he was a prisoner reasserting his claim on a weakened cell wall. The scope of his duty expanded exponentially in that moment. He wasn't just answering calls and containing individual threats. The entire city was his beat. Every pothole, every flickering streetlight, every burst water main could be a potential breach, a crack in the foundation of reality. The job of Division 0 wasn't just to fight the monsters. It was to hold the prison walls together. And the walls were crumbling. EOT. The first reports were dismissed as municipal errors. Traffic on a one-way street began flowing in both directions, causing gridlock and confusion. Drivers swore the one-way signs had simply vanished, but city records showed they had never been there in the first place. Then, the city square felt wrong. People would walk through it and feel a nagging sense of emptiness, as if something was missing. No one could remember the grand, bronze statue of the city's founder that had stood in the center of the square for over a century. It wasn't just gone, the very memory of it had been erased from the collective consciousness, leaving only a phantom ache. Dr. Finch identified the perpetrator with a kind of weary resignation. "We have a Class 4 conceptual predator," he announced in the briefing room. "An architect of absences. It doesn't consume matter or energy. It consumes concepts. It is, for all intents and purposes, a living void that feeds on ideas." He gestured to a screen showing a satellite image of the city square. It started with simple things. The southbound direction of a street. The memory of a statue. But it is getting bolder. In the last 12 hours, we've had reports from a law firm where the concept of legal precedent ceased to exist, throwing their entire case history into chaos. At a nearby bank, the idea of debt temporarily vanished from their ledgers. How do you fight something that isn't there? Kaido asked, her voice tight. That, Finch said, is the central tactical problem. You cannot shoot a concept. You cannot contain an absence. Physical force is useless. Salt iron rounds will pass right through it, as there is nothing for them to disrupt. The entity is intangible, invisible, and can only be perceived by the holes it leaves in the world. The effects began to hit closer to home. During a tactical drill, Marcus and Kaido found themselves unable to work together. The easy, professional trust they had built was gone, replaced by a jarring sense of suspicion. They couldn't anticipate each other's movements, couldn't finish each other's sentences. Finch, monitoring their biometrics from his lab, saw their cortisol levels spike. The entity had fed on the concept of partnership within their immediate vicinity. It is an apex predator of the mind, Finch's voice came over the comms, laced with urgency. It is targeting the fundamental ideas that allow a society to function. Trust. Direction. History. If we don't stop it, it could erase the concept of law or order or even self. We must bait it. His plan was as abstract as the entity itself. It feeds on coherent, established concepts, he explained. Therefore, the only thing it cannot consume is a true logical paradox. A concept that is fundamentally incoherent. We are going to feed it a poison pill, a statement that is both true and false at the same time. The trap was a device of Finch's own design, a conceptual resonator. It looked like a satellite dish made of polished copper, covered in complex etchings. It would be placed in the city square, the epicenter of the entity's activity. Marcus and Kaido were tasked with setting it up and protecting it. The resonator will broadcast a single, looping statement on a psychic frequency, Finch instructed. The statement is this statement is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. It is a perfect, self-negating loop. They set up the device in the empty center of the square. The air was thick with a feeling of profound wrongness. Street signs seemed to flicker, their meanings momentarily uncertain. For a terrifying second, Marcus looked at Kaido and couldn't remember her name. He gripped the side of the resonator, anchoring himself to its purpose. Device is active, Finch, Kaido said into her calm. The entity will be drawn to it, Finch replied. It is the most powerful, complex concept in the area. It won't be able to resist. Brace yourselves. They didn't see anything. They felt it. A wave of conceptual vertigo washed over them. The color blue seemed less certain. The idea of up felt negotiable. Marcus felt the concept of duty begin to fray in his mind, the edges becoming thin and transparent. He focused on the paradox, repeating it in his head like a mantra. This statement is false. This statement is false. The space around the resonator began to warp. It wasn't a visual distortion, but a mental one. The very idea of the air in front of them seemed to curdle and tear. A silent, mental scream of pure frustration echoed in their minds. The entity was trying to consume the paradox, but its logic was breaking against the impossible loop. It was like a carnivore trying to eat its own teeth. With a final, shattering pulse of non-existence, the feeling vanished. The air in the square settled. The street signs solidified back into their mundane certainty. Marcus looked at Kaido, and the familiar, hard-won trust between them snapped back into place. Finch? Status? Marcus asked, his breathing heavy. The conceptual disturbance has ceased, Finch's voice returned, tinged with relief. The entity appears to have collapsed in on itself. By attempting to consume a perfect paradox, it was forced to negate its own existence. It has, in effect, eaten itself. They stood in the center of the now normal square. The statue was still gone, its memory erased forever, a permanent scar of absence on the city's history. They had one, but the cost was a piece of the world that could never be recovered. Among the items recovered from Julian, the man who had dissolved into light and whispers, was a small, clay amulet, overlooked in the initial chaos. It hadn't shown up on any of Finch's metaphysical sensors. It was just a piece of fired clay. But under microscopic analysis, Finch found a series of markings baked into its surface, a pattern too complex to be decorative. Cross-referencing it with the archives, he found a partial match in a footnote of a file detailing pre-colonial tribal folklore. The footnote cited the work of a local historian, deemed an eccentric and a crank by the academic community, Dr. Anya Sharma. The name was a jolt of cold electricity for Marcus. Anya Sharma was the woman who had called them to Julian S. apartment. The complainant whose testimony had been officially dismissed as a psychotic break in the sanitized report. She wasn't crazy, Marcus said, looking at the file on the screen. She knew. She knew what was happening to him. Following protocol, Marcus and Kaito paid a visit to Dr. Sharma. They found her not in a university office, but in a cluttered apartment above a bookstore, the air thick with the scent of old books and brewing tea. Stacks of papers, maps, and obscure historical texts covered every available surface. It was the apartment of an obsessive, a Cassandra doomed to see a truth no one else would believe. Marcus recognized her immediately. The pale, drawn face was the same, but the fear was gone, replaced by a weary, knowing intelligence. She did not seem surprised to see them. "I wondered when you would come back, officers," she said, pouring a cup of tea. "The real you, I mean. Not the ones who signed that ridiculous report." "We're here about Julian," Marcus said, getting straight to the point. "And this." He placed a photograph of the amulet on the table. Anya Sharma looked at the photo and her expression hardened. "The lockbreaker sigil," she said softly. "Where did you find this?" "It was on him." She sank into a chair, her gaze distant. "Then it's worse than I thought." Julian was a sensitive. He could feel the city's architecture. The real architecture. He told me the wards were failing, that he could hear the old voices getting louder. He was trying to reinforce them, to gather the echoes of the city's history to patch the holes. He wasn't stealing them. He was trying to save them. "And the amulet?" Kaito pressed. "It's a counter-sigil," Anya explained. "A key. Designed to nullify or disrupt the types of thaumaturgic patterns used in the city's founding wards. Someone must have given it to him. Or planted it on him. It would have amplified the metaphysical energies he was exposed to, causing the overload you witnessed." Marcus felt a new, chilling dimension of the situation unfold. Julian's death wasn't a random event. It was a targeted attack. Who would do that? Anya stood and walked to a large map of the city pinned to her wall. It was covered in a web of colored strings and annotations, connecting locations of recent strange events, a power outage here, a water main break there. To a normal person, it was a chaotic mess. To Marcus, who had seen the archives, it was a schematic of a failing prison. "These breaches are not random," she said, her finger tracing a line that connected the dockside void, Julian's apartment, and the St. Jude Bridge. "They are too precise. Too coordinated. Hitting known weak points in the containment grid in a sequence designed to cause a cascading failure. The power grid goes down, weakening the ward. Then the water main bursts, disrupting the iron-laced pipes. Each event makes the next one easier." She turned to face them, her eyes burning with the conviction of a truth long held in secret. "You're thinking of this as a maintenance problem, a natural decay. It's not. This is a demolition. Someone on the inside, someone with access to the city's true blueprints, is systematically dismantling the cage." The implications were staggering. All this time, Division Zero had been treating symptoms, running from fire to fire, plugging holes in a dam that was being actively dynamited. They were not fighting a natural degradation of the system. They were fighting a conspiracy. An internal saboteur was intentionally freeing the anomalous entities, the old gods, from their civic prison. "Who?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Anya admitted. "But they are following a pattern laid out in the oldest folklore. A ritual of unbinding. And if the pattern holds, the next step will not be a subtle failure of infrastructure. It will be a public spectacle. Something to generate a massive amount of chaotic, emotional energy for the larger entities to feed on. Anya Sharma's prediction came true with terrifying speed. The city's annual Carnivale of Lights was a week-long street festival, a chaotic explosion of parades, music, and masquerade balls. It was exactly the kind of large-scale, emotionally charged public spectacle she had warned them about. Division Zero was on high alert, but they didn't know what to look for until the reports started trickling in. People were acting strangely, but not in the overt, manic way of the radio goddess victims. These changes were subtle. A quiet man known for his gentle demeanor suddenly engaging in a violent street brawl. A happily married woman seen leaving a bar with a stranger. Minor, but jarring, breaks in character. The only common thread was the masks. Every victim had been wearing a festival mask. "It's a possession entity," Finch confirmed, his voice tense over their encrypted comms. "A legion, for lack of a better term. It uses the masks as a conduit, a point of entry. The anonymity of the mask, the willingness of the wearer to suspend their own identity, makes them vulnerable. It can jump from host to host, but it can only inhabit one person at a time. The problem is, it leaves behind a psychic imprint on the previous hosts, causing these personality shifts." The mission was a nightmare of logistics and tactics. They had to operate undercover, mingling with the dense, joyful crowds that thronged the city streets. They couldn't use overt force or cause a panic, which would only feed the entity more of the chaotic energy it craved. Their target was a single, anonymous person in a crowd of thousands, and the target could change at any moment. "The entity will be drawn to the center of the festival, the point of highest emotional energy," Finch instructed. "But we can't get close enough to use our standard containment gear without being noticed. We have to tag it first." The tag was a device disguised as a small, ornate pin. Once attached to the hostess clothing, it would emit a low-level metaphysical pulse that only MCD equipment could track, allowing a secondary team to move in for extraction. Marcus, Kaito, and Chen, who had been quietly recruited into Division Zero after Marcus vouched for her resilience, were the undercover team. Each carried a single pin. They moved through the river of dancing, laughing people, their senses on high alert. They weren't looking for a monster, they were looking for a subtle wrongness. A dancer whose movements were just a little too fluid, a little too perfect. A masked reveler whose laughter didn't quite reach their eyes. It was like looking for a single grain of sand on a mile-long beach. Marcus spotted the first potential host near the main stage. A man in an elegant silver mask was dancing with an unnatural, hypnotic grace that drew a small crowd. His eyes, visible through the mask's slits, were devoid of the joyous energy around him. They were cold, ancient, and observant. "Possible host, Sector Gamma," by the stage, Marcus murmured into his lapel mic. "Moving to engage." He began to work his way through the crowd, trying to get close enough to plant the pin. As he got within 10 feet, the man in the silver mask suddenly stopped dancing. His head snapped around, his cold gaze locking directly onto Marcus. The entity knew it was being hunted. The man smiled, a thin, predatory curl of the lips, and then deliberately bumped into a woman wearing a simple, feathered mask. For a split second, a faint shimmer of light passed between them. The man in the silver mask sagged, his movements becoming clumsy and human again. The woman, however, straightened up, her posture changing, her movements acquiring that same unnervingly perfect grace. The entity had jumped. "Post has transferred," Marcus relayed. "New host is female, feathered mask, moving west toward the river." Kaito picked up the pursuit. The entity was toying with them, leading them on a chase through the labyrinthine festival. It jumped hosts 3 more times, using the dense crowd as a shield. Each time they got close, it would transfer, leaving a bewildered civilian in its wake. It was intelligent, evasive, and seemed to be enjoying the hunt. The final jump was the most dangerous. The entity transferred to a large, muscular man in a grotesque, horned mask who was working security at the edge of the crowd. This time, it didn't flee. It turned to face Chen, who was closest. "It's not running anymore," she said, her voice tight. "It's going to fight." The security guard took a step toward her, his movements unnaturally fast. Before Marcus or Kaido could intervene, Chen made her move. Instead of backing away, she lunged forward, feigning a stumble, and collided with the man. In the brief moment of contact, she deftly palmed the pen from her pocket and pressed it onto the back of his jacket. "Tag is live," she said, scrambling back. The host roared, a sound that was not human, and swatted at the pen, but it was too late. On their tactical displays, a single, bright dot began to pulse. "Host is tagged," Kaido confirmed. "Extraction team, you are green to go." From a nearby alley, a team of plain-clothed NCD officers moved in, surrounding the possessed security guard. They didn't draw weapons. They deployed a sonic device that emitted a high-frequency tone, inaudible to most humans but agonizing to the entity. The man collapsed, and the officers swiftly dragged him into an unmarked van. The operation was a success, but the cost was still being counted. Dozens of civilians were now walking around with a subtle but permanent psychic scar, their personalities altered in ways they would never understand. The city was safe for another night, but it was a city of strangers. The debriefing for the Carnivali operation was tense. They had contained the Legion entity, but Finch's analysis confirmed that the saboteur had achieved their goal. The chaotic emotional energy generated by the festival had significantly weakened the metaphysical wards around the city's financial district. It was another precise, strategic blow. "They used the entity as a diversion and a power source," Rostova stated, her voice cold as steel. "While we were chasing puppets in the street, they were advancing their endgame." Officer Chen, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, suddenly flinched. She brought a hand to her temple, her knuckles white. "Sir, my comms." Finch's head snapped up. "What about them, officer?" "Their SA, whisper." Underneath the static. "A voice," she said, her own voice strained. Marcus remembered the Legion SMO. It left psychic imprints, scars on the minds of its hosts. But they hadn't accounted for a transfer through technology. "Chen, when the host touched you, did it make contact with your earpiece?" Finch asked, his tone urgent. I think so. It knocked against my head when I stumbled," she replied, her face pale. "Get her to my lab." "Now," Finch commanded. In the sterile environment of his diagnostic suite, Finch hooked Chen's comm unit up to a series of oscilloscopes and analyzers. He placed Chen herself in a shielded observation chair, monitoring her brainwaves. The entity was a Gestalt consciousness, a network, Finch explained as lines of code scrolled rapidly down a screen. When it made contact with your comms, it treated the MCD network as just another host to jump to. Our firewalls must have kicked it out, but not before it left an echo of itself behind, a fragment of its code embedded in our system. On the main monitor, a waveform appeared. It was the whisper Chen had heard, now visualized. It was a complex, repeating pattern, a psychic residue of the entity. But as Finch filtered out the entity's signal, something else became clear. Underneath it was a second layer of data, something that wasn't part of the entity at all. "That's impossible," Finch murmured, leaning closer to the screen. "That's an MCD command line authorization. A user access code." The Legion entity, in its brief incursion into their secure network, had latched onto the digital trail of the last user to access a specific set of sensitive files. Those files, Finch discovered with a few keystrokes, were the original architectural plans for the Sidious warding system, the very blueprints the saboteur would need. The entity had inadvertently brushed against their traitor and carried away their digital scent. "The echo in Chen's comms isn't just a psychic remnant," Finch said, his voice a mix of horror and dawning realization. "It's a fingerprint. The entity's energy is resonating with the saboteur's own unique biosignature, which was encoded into their security credentials." He began a frantic search, using the fragment of code as a key to unlock network logs that should have been sealed and untraceable. He was tracing the ghost in the machine, following a trail not of IP addresses and logins, but of psychic resonance and metaphysical data. The saboteur had been a ghost, moving through their most secure systems without a trace. But they had made one mistake. They had been in the system at the same time as an otherworldly predator. "I have a location," Finch announced, his voice grim. The entire team, Marcus, Kaido, Chen, and Rostova, watched as a single point on a schematic of the precinct building began to blink red. It was a location that was supposed to be empty, a sealed, decommissioned vault in the deepest sublevel, directly beneath City Hall. They weren't just accessing the files, Marcus said, the pieces clicking into place. They were accessing them from the heart of the machine itself. The saboteur wasn't just a hacker or a disgruntled employee feeding information to the outside. They were inside Division 0. And they had been using the command center of the entire containment system as their personal base of operations. The call was coming from inside the house. The Vault's existence was a secret even within Division 0. According to Finch's schematics, it was accessible only through a service tunnel that branched off from the precinct's sub-basement, leading to a point deep beneath the foundations of City Hall. The official city blueprints labeled the space as Geological Survey Core Sample Storage, a lie hiding a far more profound truth. Captain Rostova led the tactical team herself. Marcus as Kaido and Chen moved behind her, their weapons drawn, their senses honed to a razor's edge. The air in the tunnel grew colder as they advanced, and a low, almost sub-audible hum vibrated through the concrete floor. They reached a massive, circular steel door, like that of a bank vault, sealed with a locking mechanism that combined modern biometrics with ancient, arcane symbols etched into the metal. The door was ajar. Inside, the chamber was immense, a cavern of polished black stone and gleaming brass. In the center of the room stood a containment apparatus unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. It wasn't a cage of energy beams or a reinforced cell. It was more like a massive, mechanical heart. Intricate conduits, like arteries, pulsed with a soft, golden light, feeding into a central crystalline sphere. The sphere was suspended in a complex gimbal of interlocking rings, all covered in the same intricate sigils as the door. But the apparatus was silent, and the crystal at its core was dark, fractured by a web of cracks that emanated from a single, shattering impact point. Shards of crystal, like frozen light, lay scattered on the floor. What was this thing? Kaido breathed, her voice echoing in the vast, dead space. Finch, who was monitoring them remotely, his voice a strained whisper in their ears, provided the answer. It's the heart of the whole system. The Nexus. The archives referred to it as the anchor. It wasn't designed to imprison an entity. It was designed to sustain one. He pulled up an old, hand-drawn illustration on their tactical displays. It showed the same machine, but with the crystal whole and glowing, and a radiant, vaguely serpentine form of light coiled within it. The founders of the city didn't just build a prison, Finch explained, his voice filled with a terrible awe. They made a deal with one of the entities, a powerful, benevolent, symbiotic one. A guardian. They gave it a sanctuary, a direct connection to the city's lifeblood, and in return, it projected a protective aura, a reality stabilization field, that reinforced the entire containment grid. It didn't just power the wards, its very presence kept the other, more predatory entities dormant and compliant. It was the alpha predator, the keeper of the peace. Marcus looked at the shattered crystal, the darkened conduits, the dead machine. The truth fell into place with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. All the recent events, the increasing frequency of incursions, the weakening of the wards, the rising aggression of the entities, it wasn't just because of sabotage. It was because the city's primary defender was gone. The saboteur hadn't been picking locks on individual cells. They had killed the warden. The neutralization of the anchor was their first move, Rostova said, her voice grim as she ran a gloved hand over the dead crystal. Everything since, the ferryman, the god of static, the legion, they are all just consequences. The prisoners are realizing the guards are dead. Chen knelt, examining a set of fresh footprints in the dust near the base of the machine. Someone was here recently. Standard issue MCD tactical boots. She looked up, her gaze meeting Marcus's. The saboteur wasn't just in their network. They were walking the same hallways. The scope of the conspiracy was larger and more terrifying than any of them had imagined. This was not about simply causing chaos. This was a deliberate, calculated act to remove the city's greatest protector, to throw open the gates and let the gods of chaos reclaim their old territory. They had been fighting a losing battle from the start, trying to patch a system whose heart had already been ripped out. Back in the sub-basement, an unnerving silence filled the briefing room. Finch stood before the main monitor, his face ashen. The digital signature, the psychic fingerprint recovered from Chen S. had been fully decoded. It was not a string of code associated with a hacker or an unknown operative. It was a biosignature, unique and irrefutable, linked directly to the highest level of security clearance in Division 0. It was a perfect match for Captain Eva Rostova. The team stood in stunned disbelief, the truth refusing to compute. Kaido, Chen, Marcus, they all looked to their captain, who had been standing silently by the door of the empty chamber, observing the shattered nexus. She didn't deny it. Her expression was not one of guilt, but of profound, tragic conviction. "It is true," she said, her voice steady, devoid of the clipped, professional tone they were used to. It was the voice of a zealot. "I shattered the crystal. I disabled the nexus. I set it free." Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. "Why? You command this division. Your duty is to contain them." "My duty," Rostova corrected him, her pale gray eyes fixing on him with an unnerving intensity, "is to my family. And to the being they were sworn to protect." She walked toward the dead machine, her hand tracing the edge of a darkened conduit. "My family were not just founders of this city. We were the original keepers. We brokered the pact with the anchor, the guardian you see shattered here. It was a partnership, a symbiosis. The city gave it sanctuary, and it gave the city peace. But your predecessors, the founders of this division, they grew fearful of its power. They twisted the pact. They turned the nexus from a sanctuary into a prison. They enslaved it." Her voice was laced with a righteous fury that had been hidden for years beneath a mask of command. "For generations, my family served as its jailers, forced to maintain the machine that tortured the very entity we had sworn to protect. I was raised on the stories of what it was like before, a city where man and entity lived in a delicate, respectful balance. This division destroyed that balance. You replaced respect with containment, partnership with protocols. You saw what us out there now," Kaido interjected, her voice sharp with disbelief. "The chaos. The people who get hurt. The ferrymen, the legion. You unleashed them." "I did not unleash them," Rostova countered, her gaze unwavering. "I restored the balance. I believed that by freeing the anchor, its immense, benevolent power would once again bring the lesser entities to heel, not through force, but through its rightful, awesome presence. It would remind them of the old ways." "But it didn't," Finch said softly from the calms, his voice filled with a dawning horror. "Captain, the archives are clear. The anchor wasn't keeping them in check because it was more powerful. It was keeping them in check because its presence was the only thing hiding the city from them. The truth crashed down on them all. The anchor as reality-stabilizing field had been a cloak, a metaphysical veil that made the city appear mundane and uninteresting to the more powerful, predatory gods that existed in the spaces between worlds." Rostova's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of doubt, a crack in her zealous certainty. "What are you saying?" "You didn't free the city as warden," Finch stated, his voice trembling. "You just turned off the lighthouse in the middle of a feeding round. You haven't restored the balance. You've just rung the dinner bell." The low hum Marcus had felt in the tunnel was growing louder, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to be coming from the city itself. The walls of the chamber trembled, and dust sifted from the ceiling. Rostova's act of liberation, born from a misguided sense of duty and a generational grudge, had not freed a noble protector. It had just painted a target on the back of every man, woman, and child in the city she had sworn to protect. The city did not fall to fire and brimstone. It began to unravel, thread by thread, like a cheap suit. With the anchor as reality-stabilizing field gone, the fundamental laws of physics became less like laws and more like gentle suggestions. Rostova was taken into custody, her zealous certainty replaced by a catatonic horror at what she had done. But it was too late. The damage was done. Marcus, Kaido, and Chen, now the de facto command team, saw the unraveling begin on their way back to the surface. Hallways in the precinct that had been straight now curved at impossible angles. A flight of stairs they descended led them, inexplicably, to a floor higher than where they had started. Time itself grew sluggish and unreliable clocks would race forward for an hour, then tick backward for 3. On the streets, it was worse. Gravity in the financial district became intermittent, with pedestrians and vehicles occasionally drifting a few feet into the air before settling back down with a gentle bump. The skyline began to shift and warp, the familiar glass and steel towers bending like wax in the sun, sometimes sprouting gargoyles or balconies that hadn't been there a moment before. The public reaction was not the panic they had expected. Decades of living on a metaphysical fault line had left a psychic residue in the population. Faced with the impossible, they did not scream and run. They knelt and worshipped. Marcus saw a crowd of people gathered in the middle of a major intersection, their faces turned upward in reverent awe at a cloud that was slowly taking the shape of a massive, multifaceted eye. Commuters on a bus that had phased halfway into the wall of a building were not trying to escape, they were pressing their hands to the windows, trying to touch the strange, crystalline structures that had grown inside. The city was not dying. It was converting. The NCDS mission changed overnight. Containment was no longer possible. The number of incursions was too vast, the nature of the phenomena too widespread. They were no longer cops. They were rescue workers in a slow-motion apocalypse of the mind. "We can't stop this," Finch's voice crackled over their new, hardwired comms, the only communication system still reliable. "The metaphysical pressure is too high. All we can do is mitigate the damage. Our new priority is identifying and evacuating citizens whose cognitive frameworks are still intact. We have to save who we can." The job became a grim triage. They would move through a neighborhood where the streets had turned to flowing water, not to fight the phenomenon, but to find the family huddled in their attic, still believing that water should not flow uphill. They would enter an office building where the employees were calmly typing on keyboards that had turned into writhing snakes, looking for the one terrified accountant hiding under his desk, the only one who still remembered what a keyboard was supposed to be. They became shepherds of sanity, guiding small flocks of bewildered survivors through a landscape of miracles and horrors to designated safe zones, deep shelters and basements reinforced with the last of their functioning warding technology. During one such evacuation, Marcus stood on a rooftop, watching the city burn with a cold, beautiful fire that did not consume. He watched a flock of birds made of origami paper fly out of a subway entrance, and saw a lamppost bow respectfully to a passing woman. He had sworn an oath to protect the public. But what did that mean when the public no longer wanted protection? What was his duty when the people he was trying to save were embracing the very gods he was fighting, seeing salvation where he only saw a beautifully orchestrated end to the human world? The thin, sharp line between duty and futility was blurring. They were not losing a war. They were simply becoming irrelevant in a world that no longer remembered the rules they had fought to uphold. The safe zones were a temporary solution, islands of sanity in an ever-rising tide of chaos. They were running out of power, out of supplies, out of time. Marcus Thorne, driven by a stubborn refusal to accept the end of his watch, retreated to the one place that still held some semblance of the old order, the archives. While Kaito and Chen organized the evacuation efforts, he and Finch began a desperate, systematic search for a solution, a failsafe, a final option that the founders might have left behind. They sifted through centuries of forgotten knowledge, their search guided by Finch's intellect and Marcus's unyielding cop's intuition. They found schematics for weapons they couldn't build, containment theories for entities that hadn't yet manifested, and dozens of apocalyptic prophecies, most of which were now coming true outside their reinforced door. It was Marcus who found it, not in a complex data file, but tucked away inside a simple, leather-bound volume titled Addenda to Foundational Agreements. The pages were sealed with a wax stamp bearing the city's original crest. Inside, written in a precise, elegant hand, was a single, terrifying protocol, the anchor contingency. It was the ultimate last resort, a protocol to be enacted only in the event of a catastrophic failure of the Nexus. It was not a plan to rebuild the machine or find a new guardian entity. It was a plan to create one. "My God," Finch breathed, reading over Marcus's shoulder, his usual academic calm shattered. "It's a transference ritual." The protocol outlined a procedure, a blend of arcane ritual and advanced metaphysical science, to bind the city's chaotic, unraveling reality to a new focal point. It described how to repurpose the shattered nexus, not to hold an entity, but to channel the entirety of the city's metaphysical energy into a single, willing host. That host, the protocol stated, had to be human. The volunteer would become the new anchor. They would not gain godlike powers or command the chaos. They would simply absorb it, contain it within their own consciousness. They would become a living dam, their mind the bulwark holding back the flood of unreality. The city would stabilize, the laws of physics would reassert themselves, and the encroaching entities would be pacified, their power drawn into and neutralized by the new anchor. But the cost was absolute. The cognitive load would be infinite, Finch explained, his voice trembling as he traced the diagrams with a shaking finger. To contain that much raw, paradoxical information, the hostess' personality, their memories, their very identity, would be annihilated. They would cease to be a person. They would become a concept, a living embodiment of order. Conscious, but not sentient. A silent, eternal warden in their own mind. It was a form of self-sacrifice so complete it bordered on the incomprehensible. The volunteer would save the city, but the person they were would be utterly and irrevocably erased, leaving only the function, the duty, behind. Marcus stared at the page, at the neat, calm script describing a fate worse than death. The protocol specified the necessary qualifications for the hostess: strong will, a deep-seated sense of duty, and a cognitive framework resilient enough to withstand the initial shock of the transference. A psychological profile was attached. It was a generic template, but reading it, Marcus felt a chilling sense of recognition. It was a perfect description of the ideal NCD officer. It was a perfect description of himself. He closed the book. His duty had always been clear: to protect the public, to protect his fellow officers. The protocol didn't offer a way to win the war, it offered a way to end it. A way to restore the cage, but this time, the bars would be forged from a human soul. "We have to present this to the others," Finch said, his voice heavy. "They have to know. We have to decide." Marcus looked at his old friend, the brilliant analyst who had guided them through so many impossible situations. He saw the weight of this final, terrible discovery in the lines on Finch's face. He knew what had to be done. There was no decision to be made, not really. There was only the oath. There was only the job. And the job had to be finished. There was no argument. When Marcus announced his decision, it was met not with protest, but with the grim, solemn acceptance of soldiers who understood the cost of a necessary sacrifice. Kaido and Chen, their faces etched with a weary resolve, took up defensive positions at the entrance to the vault, their salt iron rifles ready. They were the honor guard for the end of a world, and the birth of a new one. Dr. Finch, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision, made the final adjustments to the shattered nexus. He had rerouted the remaining conduits, not to a crystal, but to a single, heavy steel chair placed at the very center of the dead machine. It was no longer a prison for an entity. It was a throne for an idea. Marcus took off his badge and placed it on Finch's workstation. It was a heavy, solid piece of metal, a tangible link to a life of tangible rules. He looked at Chen, at Kaido. No words were needed. He had served with them, protected them. Now, his duty was to do it one last time, permanently. He walked to the chair and sat down. "Whenever you're ready, officer," Finch said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer conceal behind academic detachment. "I'm ready," Marcus said. His voice did not tremble. It was the calm, steady voice of a man who had made his peace with the terms of his service. Finch nodded and activated the sequence. The machine did not roar to life. It awoke with a soft, golden hum, and the conduits that had been dark for so long began to glow with a gentle, pulsing light. The light flowed not into a crystal, but into the chair, into Marcus. It did not hurt. It was simply too much. The chaos of the city poured into him, a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered reality. He felt every impossible angle, every shifting street, every citizen's newfound and terrifying faith. He saw a building made of sorrow weep onto a sidewalk that remembered it was a river. He heard the sound of the color purple. The city's unraveling logic, its fraying physics, its beautiful, cancerous miracles, all of it flooded his consciousness. His own mind, his own history, became a tiny island in that raging ocean. He remembered his first day at the academy, the smell of rain on asphalt from his childhood, the taste of stale coffee in the precinct break room. These memories, the foundation of Marcus Thorne, began to erode, washed away by the sheer, overwhelming weight of his new reality. From his silent throne, he could now see the city not as a collection of streets and buildings, but as a single, coherent thought. And that thought was sick. He felt the change as he became the city's new organizing principle. The crooked street straightened. The weeping building remembered it was made of brick and steel. The bus that was half phased into a wall became whole again, its passengers blinking as if waking from a dream, the strange crystals in their hands fading into dust. Gravity became a law again, not a suggestion. The great, watching eye in the sky dissolved into a simple, mundane cloud. He was the anchor, and the storm was breaking against him. His name was the last thing to go. He felt it fraying, the sounds Marcus becoming meaningless vibrations. He was no longer a man, a cop, a friend. He was a function. A warden. A silent, unmoving guardian. The chaos of the city was now his own quiet, internal hum. The prison was built. But before the last flicker of self was extinguished, he performed his final duty. He reached out, not with his hands, but with the vast, city-wide consciousness that was now his, and found the minds of Finch, Kaido, and Chen. Into their thoughts, he sent one last, formal transmission, the final entry in his service record. Officer Thorne, end of watch. In the vault, the golden light faded. The hum settled into a deep, foundational silence. Marcus Thorne sat in the chair, his eyes open, but they no longer saw. His posture was perfect, his hands resting on his knees. He did not breathe. He simply was. The price had been paid. The city was safe. The guardian was in his chair. In the end, there was no protocol for the final call, no manual for the ultimate sacrifice. The story began with a job that starts where prayers are answered, and it concluded with an officer becoming the silent, eternal answer to a city's prayer for order. His duty was not just to serve and protect, but to become the very foundation of that protection, a sacrifice unseen by those who now walk safely on stabilized streets. If this harrowing account of Officer Thorne's final duty resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to Keeper of the Dark Logs for more stories from the divisions that operate in the shadows. We're left with so many questions, but one stands out: was Captain Rostova's betrayal a monstrous act of arrogance, or was it a tragic, understandable attempt to right a generational wrong? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay vigilant. Soon, we'll open a new file and explore how the surviving members of Division Zero cope with their new reality, and the unsettling discovery that a silent guardian can still find a way to file a report.